Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to get started. Hi there. Good afternoon. My name is Naomi Schaefer-Riley. I'm a resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you today to what I expect is going to be a fascinating and very productive conversation about the ways that our child welfare system can be making better use of data. In a recent interview with Bloomberg News, Steve Ballmer, who spent 14 years as CEO of Microsoft, described visiting a county department of mental health whose organizational system consisted of, quote, hundreds of sticky notes in a variety of colors tracking things like different types of programs for different ages. Not surprisingly, the whole sticky note system has failed to produce the results that we would like. Dysfunction within a single agency is only the beginning, however. In an era where there are a variety of different public and private agencies that could be helping our most vulnerable families, it is unfortunate to find that our computer systems are rarely even speaking to each other. This makes it difficult for us to know which children are most at risk and what tools we even have to help them. The fact that the data on education, child welfare, public housing, and other kinds of assistance to the poor are siloed in different agencies, different cities, and different counties, even within a single state, makes it difficult to keep children safe at the front end of the child welfare system and to help find permanent, loving homes for them if their parents are unable or unwilling to care for them. But there's hope. Today, I'm excited to be able to introduce to you two teams of researchers who are on the cutting edge of using data to improve our child welfare outcomes. So today, first, we will be hearing from Gonzaga and Thea Ramirez. John is a senior consultant of research and data analytics at Adoption Share and the director of data science for the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. He co-created the first iteration of the Family Match Assessment, an online tool for matching prospective families and children while predicting successful long-term placements for adoption. Thea is the founder and CEO of Adoption Share, a national website designed to bring efficiency and transparency to the adoption process. She was also named a Young Influencer by Catalyst. After that, I will come up. We'll have like a tiny break, and we'll then hear from our second team of researchers, Emily Putnam-Hornstein and Rima Vaithianathan. Did I get it? Emily is an associate professor of social work at the in the School of Social Work at the University of Southern California. She directs the Children's Data Network, a data and research collaborative focused on the linkage and analysis of administrative records. Rima is a professor in the School of Economics at Auckland University of Technology and the co-director of the Center for Social Data Analytics. Rima recently led an international research team in developing a predictive risk modeling tool to assist child welfare call screening decisions in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. After we hear the two presentations, then we're going to bring everyone together to have a panel discussion, and then we will be opening it up for questions from the audience. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John and Thea, and please enjoy.
Hi, thank you, and good afternoon. It is such an honor to be speaking here today. Thank you to Naomi and Will for organizing this amazing event. I just would like to share the focus of our presentation is really in theme of big data, little kids, is really showing how the Adoption Share Family Match program is changing child welfare today. But first, just for a couple of introductions, and John, I'll have you come up here too in just a second. My name is Thea Ramirez. I am the founder and CEO of a nonprofit organization called Adoption Share. Our mission is we exist to leverage technology to help create families. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through our Family Match application, which we're super excited to share with you about. I have a master's degree in clinical social work from Savannah State University, and I am super passionate about seeing change and reform come into the child welfare arena. Dr. John Gonzaga, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Dr. John Gonzaga, and I've been working with Thea and Adoption Share for about 5 years now. My background is in social psychology. I have a degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and I'll be back talking to you in a few minutes.
Great. So again, the focus of this will really be on our Adoption Share Family Match program. But first, to just set the stage as sort of the problem. What is the problem that Adoption Share is trying to solve through our Family Match program? I want to talk to you a little bit about the numbers right now in child welfare. So as of August of 2018, our child welfare program served approximately a little under 700,000 children. 442,000 of those children actually are in formal foster care, the foster care system. A little under a quarter, about 123,000 of these children have a designation or goal of waiting to be adopted. And again, as of right now in this fiscal year, we're about 48% of our way to completing that goal by the end of June. Now, if these numbers sound familiar to you, that's because they are. In fact, when you look at the AFCARS data for over the past decade, what you'll find is that every single year we're kind of hitting the same mark of success. That 50% number, we're sort of hovering around the success of getting about 50% of our kids with a goal or designation of waiting to be adopted actually adopted. And this has been happening for actually well over a decade. And anytime you hit an area where you've got this statistical, consistency, really, it's important to ask the question why, and beyond the why is how. Like what is child welfare doing? What are our chief strategies right now that we're using to help kids get into permanency through adoption? And what we have kind of called this or coined as the child-centric approach is really the number one strategy that the United States is leveraging to get kids into permanency through adoption. Child-centric, just for our quick definition of that, is any strategy or initiative that relegates or gives the onus of responsibility on a child to, quote-unquote, sort of sell him or herself to a prospective adoptive parent. We've been doing this for almost 2 centuries, beginning with the orphan trains in 1850, in which we have placed about 250,000 children in our country by taking kids that were on streets in industrialized cities, putting them on trains, putting them up on platforms, and hoping that a family would take that child in. In fact, just a quick FYI there for you, that term put up for adoption that we now find offensive actually harkens back to this era in which we literally put up kids on platforms. By 1919, there was a glimmer of hope with Dr. Jesse Taft, who wrote the first kind of publication on making an argument for perhaps there's a more scientific way to get kids into families than just putting them up on these platforms. Though her research was really limited to just investigating the child attributes that are at play, and she didn't go into the family side of the problem, it was actually a glimmer of hope, and that was 100 years ago. By 1929, we saw the end of the orphan train. By 1945, we started seeing adoption exchanges across the country bubble up to publish the pictures of predominantly African-American youth that needed to have a non-white family member recruited. And then by 1960, these same sort of publications were being used for all hard-to-place kids. And then there's kind of a jump to 2001, in which we digitalized this whole process and now have listings of children that are waiting for adoption now, publicly accessible at any time by anyone, and regardless of your motivation or intent. You can now access photo listings of children that are available today. And meanwhile, you actually have families that are waiting. There was an incredible research done by an organization called Listening to Parents that worked with the Harvard University to identify that there's actually 240,000 families that every single year will call their local child welfare agency requesting information on how to adopt a child from foster care. But less than 4% are successful in achieving that goal. Now, that was in 2011, so 8 years ago, and now we probably, our hypothesis is that the number of interested families have more than likely tripled in the advent of a number of organizations that are doing incredible work recruiting more and more foster families. And so at the end of the day, what commonly, unfortunately, gets continually reframed as a resource problem, right? Like if we just had one more family, if we could just find more families, we could solve this crisis, is really at its core a misplaced diagnosis, an incorrect diagnosis. The primary problem today in our foster care system is the inability of the current system to actually connect our waiting children with our families who can actually solve this problem for them and either provide a stable placement while they're in foster care or a forever home through adoption. That is the primary problem that Adoption Share, we feel, is best equipped to solve through the Family Match program. So just a little bit about the solution. So Family Match was created to be a data-driven application designed to promote permanency for youth through compatibility matching. So kind of building on Dr. Treff's publication back from 1919, but instead of just looking at the child attributes, also looking at the family attributes. What are the things at play that either promote disruption or success in foster and adoptive relationships? And beyond that, being able to leverage this technology in a state, allowing a state to see all of their resource families in their in one centralized location became kind of the paramount and foundation for it. Quickly before I proceed, I just want to explain how it works. Family Match is actually a URL you can go to right now if you'd like. If you're a family with an approved home study and able to foster or adopt a child, you can create an account on Family Match and complete 2 compatibility assessments that Dr. Gonzaga will be talking a little bit about today. And caseworkers upload and enter in the child. Once these assessments have been completed, both the family and child enter into the matching pool. And from there, when a match happens, our team is actually following that match from match to placement and from placement to a finalized adoption. We actually have a series of touch points on both the caseworker and the family to assess how things are actually going and using that outcomes data to actually leverage and iterate on our current matching model today, which again, Dr. Gonzaga will be sharing more. Just quickly before I hand it off to Dr. Gonzaga, one of the paramount forms of kind of what is different about Family Match and this whole approach, if I can just kind of instill anything in you today, is that we are really flipping the script with the way America is matching kids and families, and that's by being centrally family focused. Families are our solutions. If we want stable placements, if we want families to actually enter into this arena and provide foster adoptive resource options, then we have to be family focused. And so that is where we really have carved out a broad swath of our technology has been in inviting families to demonstrate and share about themselves, to talk about their families, and to have some sort of skin in the game when, after all, this is their family that's at stake as well. The other core components that Dr. John Gonzaga will be sharing more about is how Family Match is really equipped to be a centralized repository, and we'll speak to some of the strengths of that, as well as leveraging the power of data and predictive analytics to better make most appropriate matches. So here to join me is Dr. John Gonzaga.
Thank you, Thea. As we said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the technology and the data applications behind this. And one of the most exciting things when I first was introduced to this idea was how it is that we could leverage technology to be able to improve a system that already has all of the core components to be able to match families and children more effectively. I think one of the most underrated and potentially genius ideas in here was being able to bring all of the resources that you have into a centralized repository. So in many locations now, you have families and children placed into a district or an agency, which severely limits the number of individuals that you can match. And if you think about the central problem, it's not about the number of children you have in the system or the number of families you have in the system. It's the overall number of matches you can make. And the more matches you can make, the more flexible you have a system that allows you to make trade-offs between where children are going to be placed with what families. So let's say hypothetically you have an agency in Florida, where we're active right now, that has 50 families and 50 children, right? They can make 2,500 potential matches. If you said there are 20 agencies in the state of California, in the state of Florida, and you had 1,000 families and 1,000 children, you can now, in one centralized system, make 1 million matches, which creates a lot more flexibility. So that scale allows you to be able to more accurately and more effectively match children and families. And what I'm going to turn to now is how is it that you do that? What was the method that we went to in order to figure out what that system looks like? One of the things I did in my past was to help build the matching system at eHarmony. And one of the things that we base that system on is that there is a tremendously long literature that takes a look at what makes relationships successful over the long haul. There's an equally long scientific literature that looks at what are the attributes that make families, that make foster care and adoptions successful over the long haul. So when did they disrupt and when are they successful? So our initial idea was to look back at the existing research literature and take advantage of the expertise that is already out there and look at the attributes that have been scientifically validated to predict long-term disruption. And these are just some of them out there. We know, for example, that personality makes a difference. We know, for example, that children's attributes make a difference. We know, for example, that the context that parents come in make a difference. And really, these attributes broke down into 4 major categories. One, most well established, are the attributes of the child. So children who have behavioral problems tend to do worse. Children that go through lots of placements tend to do worse over time. What has also been shown in the literature is that there are attributes of the family that make them stronger or weaker candidates to be matched with. So if they have resources in their background, how committed are they to the relationship? Do they have a support structure underneath them that is going to be able to help them? There is also a lot about the situation. What resources are actually available to the families to be able to get through what is going to be a huge transition for them when they bring a new child into the household? And most importantly for us, there are attributes of the unique match between families and children that predict whether or not they're successful. So for example, it's been shown that kids who are exceptionally sensitive have to be, or sort of like shy, have to be placed into what are called attachment-sensitive families. Families that are extra sensitive to what their emotional needs are. And if you don't place them there, their outcomes are going to be a lot worse. It's also shown, for example, that if you place a kid high in negativity into a household with a mother who tends to be a very authoritarian parent, that leads to bad outcomes. Now, that's not an attribute of the child or an attribute of the parent. Both of those things can be successful if the placement is made correctly. What it's an attribute is of the match. So we took this to be able to develop a matching system that allows us to take in the attributes of the children, the families, and the match and predict what is going to be most successful. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this works. So the first thing that we do is, and we currently have an algorithm that takes care of 2 things. The first is we need to take a look at what we call deal breakers. Like, what are the things that families are unable or unwilling to take care of because they don't have the resources or that's just not their preference. So if a family does not want to take care of a teenager because they don't feel comfortable doing that, then why should we show them teenagers? Shouldn't we just screen through and figure out which one of the children actually fit the attributes that they have? This allows us to take the whole system. So instead of screening through 1,000 matches, you screen through 100 matches to be able to see which ones are most successful, or are most likely to be successful. On top of that, we then take the existing matches that are left, the matches that are left, and we score them. We take a look at the attributes of the child, the attributes of the family, the attributes of the match, and we come up with a score that ranks their likelihood of disruption. Now, these are just these are hypothetical scores. This is actually not the real scoring system that we have. But it allows you to see which of these families are the most likely destinations for children to have the greatest likelihood of success. Now, this does not mean they will be successful in that situation. It just means that all other things being equal, they are more likely to be successful with this family than they would be for another family. And it allows the caseworker to then take a look at the most likely families, the ones that are most compatible, and then do their due diligence about whether or not that family is actually a good destination for that child. The most powerful thing, and the thing that our central repository and the collective data system allows us to do, is to optimize the solution. Because when you are thinking about it from where am I going to place this child, I'm not actually thinking about the trade-offs of, like, if I take this child and put them with the best family, maybe that means that other children in the system aren't going to be placed as well, or are not going to have families. So if a child only has a few options, you may want to take care of that child first and allow children with more options, even if they go with a family that isn't their highest compatibility score or the best family that's out there. This is not something that we're currently put into the system, but as we scale and leverage the power of data over time, it will get stronger and stronger. Now, the great thing about this system is even though we have based all of this on the existing literature, so we feel very confident that the attributes are the things that are most critical to predicting long-term success, We know that the weightings of this algorithm are not optimal right now because we have not actually looked at what the outcomes of those children are going to be. Family Match follows these children, follows these matches, follows the families that are created, and figures out which ones disrupt, which ones are most satisfied over time. And even though we currently do not have the data to do this, we'll follow these families and retrain our algorithm models on actual outcomes, which allows us to be flexible to the type of relationship that we're trying to build. Foster care is going to be different from adoptions, as well as being able to take care of the contextual conditions that may vary from state to state or agency to agency. So like Netflix, like Facebook, we will learn our way into making this algorithm better and stronger over time. And with that, I'm going to turn back over to Thea to talk about, oh, sorry, I have one more slide. This leads to what we believe is going to be a virtuous cycle for our matching system. As we bring families into a centralized repository, we're able to make better matches more efficiently and place more children into placements. By following them across time, we can retrain our model, and those successes lead to better word of mouth, an easier way of bringing people into the system of acquiring new families. And as more children become in, the system gets more efficient at making better and better matches, which leads to better outcomes, which leads to more kids coming out of the system, which leads to a stronger system that should draw more people in. And with that, I'm going to turn back to Thea, that she can talk about some of the places that we've piloted this so far.
So 2018, the fiscal year 2018 has been quite an exciting year that we're just about to conclude here at the end of June. We actually launched two pilots around the same time in July. July in Virginia being predominantly our first official statewide pilot that was backed by with the support of the General Assembly and Virginia Department of Social Services. And around that same time, we also launched a pilot in the state of Florida. Overachiever much? Question mark. I'm just kidding. Okay, so in Virginia, we really kind of started our focus as like a grassroots movement. Although we had a strong support from the General Assembly and Virginia Department of Social Services, Virginia as a Commonwealth is a decentralized state, meaning that we really had to kind of take it on the road and really enlist the participation of the pilot opportunity to a number of DSS offices. In fact, there's about 120. So we had our work cut out for us. In that time frame, we were able to successfully onboard about 100 child placement agencies within the past 10 to 11 months. About 50% of those are DSS offices, so these are county-run offices. We also welcomed about 400 families and onboarded about 294 cases. So these are kids that have had their assessments completed on their behalf by a caseworker. But although we had the support of VDSS and the General Assembly, and although we had a lot of enthusiasm, and although we had a lot of diversity among the family, I'll just pause here and tell you that even piloting in 2 states right now, our family pools statistics have remained virtually the same. And in both states, we're seeing that 50% of our families are wanting an older youth. We're seeing that 51% of our families are interested in kids with disabilities. 80% are open to more than one child. 64% are interested in either gender. 59% open to all race. So in fact, this narrative that continually gets pushed out that we have kids that some people wouldn't want to be matched with is quite frankly not true. And they're just waiting there. So although we had that large diversity of families and the enthusiasm of the stakeholders in Virginia, we've really only experienced and achieved just a handful of matches, placements, and finalized adoptions within this past year. But Florida, on the other hand, was a different story. In Florida, we actually had more of a grass tops scenario. We actually partnered with an organization called the Selfless Love Foundation that really made it possible for us to target the leadership at CBCs, which is their community-based care model in Florida. And by getting the buy-in of the workers in each and every one of those agencies, we actually were able to bring on 95% of the CBCs within the first couple months alone. And that sort of environment and participation actually kind of got us over the hurdle. Within 10 months, we successfully matched 160 kids That's 20%, okay? That's 20% of the hardest to place kids in 10 months. And that's only by virtue of just 50% of our CBCs that are using it, that we're able to actually at least have a minimum of one match. So if you think about that for a moment, the amount of potential there by just having every single CBC participating even, and as we continue our work in Florida, we could more than likely double that number in a very short amount of time. And so the time to match, which is something that is not currently being tracked by either the state or the federal government right now in Florida, was just over 2.5 months. So that meant that the child had a TPR and had been waiting, and then they were registered on Family Match. And by the time they were registered on Family Match, so their duration, their life cycle in Family Match, it took about 2.5 months to get them matched. Now, why is that significant? A lot of our children in Family Match, because this is the hardest to place kids, these are the kids that get to TPR and do not have an identified family. These are the kids that have been in the system for over 2 years without an identified family. So their journey in foster care started way before that TPR started, right? So these kids have been in there the longest, and some of them are getting matched in as little as 18 days. So as John has talked us through what the power of a centralized repository, the power of really turning on a light switch and allowing placement workers to be able to see the totality of all of their resource options, we can already prove out the efficacy on that front right away. Which is really very, very exciting. 46% of our placements in Florida have celebrated finalized adoptions. And as John said, we expect and anticipate that we will have some disruptions. In fact, right now we're heartened to know that 10% is about our disruption rate currently, which compared to the expected rate of between 15 and 25% is encouraging, which is the national reported disruption rate currently. This is just some of the exciting things that have happened in Florida. Just a typical, I guess the data that we have on kids and families. So we have over 1,100 families that have been registered lifetime. So some of those kids have obviously been matched, adopted, have their cases, something has changed in their goal. We've had lifetime 1,200 families registered. And so we see a lot of potential to continue to grow. But obviously, as I mentioned, we've been doing these 2 pilots, right? One in Virginia, one in Florida. What's the difference? So I just kind of want to close with a lessons learned opportunity in terms of what we have found to have been the gas on the fire, the accelerator to getting more and more kids into permanency and really having a landscape that's the most ideal for this kind of technology and innovation to perform at an optimal rate. The first takeaway here is that this solving the connection problem is actually an achievable problem. This is something that we can actually do in our lifetime. We don't have to continually see these AFCAR reports that are just showing a 50% success rate. Like, we can actually move the needle in this by employing this sort of technology and data. The second takeaway is that what we've learned is the structure of a state can impact greatly the speed at which we can resolve these connection issues. So for states that have more of a county-run or county-administered kind of setup, which many states in this country do, our hypothesis is that they're going to have a little bit of a tougher road in terms of strengthening those connections and allowing the sharing of families from one county to the next to meet a need. Whereas a state like Florida, that although it's privatized and you have CBC to CBC across the state, you have kind of a backbone that allows that sort of sharing and incentivizes the collaboration among one region with another. The third is that data is absolutely key and is so important, as Dr. Gonzaga explained earlier. But also in terms of our own learnings and what we've found, to be able to leverage our learnings and hand that over to our stakeholders in the states that we're working in has actually informed better practices. In Florida, we've seen one particular agency that actually was able to almost match 40% of their kids in as little as 6 months, started to see the efficiency of this and rethought their own process flow of how their internal organization operated to keep up with this kind of efficiency. And in Virginia, we've really seen that there are really 3 sort of big challenges, problem statements that the data has been able to build out a better narrative and story around. One being that when families don't actually have access to their home studies, when a family is not given their ability, to maintain ownership of that central precious record, that family's journey in trying to adopt or foster is a little bit of a slower road. Also, that collaborative relationships and cooperative agreements are huge and can be game changers in a state that has a lot of emphasis and power going to the county level. And lastly, the line delineation. So in some states, you have a foster to adopt line. And in Florida, we were able to see that families could be foster families, they could be adoptive families, or they could be duly licensed. By having states that just have one centralized line, the foster to adopt line, oftentimes because the foster care matching is a big deal and we have more demand on foster families as a resource, workers are more incentivized to just be working with their contingency of foster families. So if you raise your hand and say, I'd like to adopt, but really like 90% of my problem as a caseworker is finding foster homes, I might just kind of put you at the bottom of the list or maybe not even contact you or use you as a resource because that's not my most pressing need. So oftentimes we see that kids that are waiting to be adopted in certain setups across our country actually have a lower likelihood of achieving those goals because of that structure. And then lastly, as just in conclusion, and this might seem a little bit ironic because I am speaking at AEI and we're talking about data and technology, but I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that technology is never the silver bullet. You can have the most innovative and amazing program, but if you're putting that on top of a broken process, it's not going to equal improved efficiency, right? It's not going to get you the goals that you need. And I think that's an important thing and also kind of a segue to my last point of lessons learned, is that the role of and the work of nonprofits is so imperative in this space, particularly as it relates to technology. I can't tell you enough. As a nonprofit founder and CEO, my desire is not to sell a license to a state, to sell a product and walk away and give you maybe 1 or 2 enhancements a year. Our goal is transformation. And so for those of us in the child welfare community to really embrace and rally around our nonprofit organizations that are moving the needle is really paramount in making sure that we're actually being able to build and posture our solutions to be unified and not sort of subsets of productizations across our country. That work is incredibly important, and we need your support. We can't do this without the time, talent, and resources and treasures that many of us have access to and could give to move the needle. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to give you one quick note. For those of you lay people in the audience, TPR is termination of parental rights. We're going to try to stick to as few acronyms as possible so everyone has access to this. And with that, I'm going to call up Emily and Rima to talk about their research.
Thank you so much for inviting us, and it's been such a pleasure to... Oh. What should I do? One more? Excellent, thank you. So you're going to wonder why a New Zealander is here working in Allegheny. I just love pierogies and beer, and I can't get enough of them. If you're from Pittsburgh, pierogi is this wonderful concoction of mashed potato wrapped with dough around it because you can never get enough carbohydrates. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So thank you very much. We've been working in Allegheny family screening, developing the Allegheny family screening tool now for over 4 or 5 years. I led an international team which won the RFP to do this. And so I'm going to walk through very simply what this tool does, what the impact evaluation is for it, and then Emily's going to talk to some of the potential of this type of work in bigger settings and whether it's scalable. So one of our favorite people is Erin Dalton, who's deputy director at Allegheny County, and she loves to quote. She always sort of teases us as academics that we are constantly doing quotes. So she wants a quote herself, and this is a quote that I think is a real $1 million shot. You know what's scarier than predictive risk modeling to help make important decisions? It's the way that we're making those decisions right now. So for most people who live in the world of child welfare and child protection systems, We know that we're not doing the best that we can. We know that if someone gets called in on Monday and gets Dave, they get a different result to if they get called in on Friday and get Janet. We know there's lots of unwarranted variation in how we're looking after our families. And the striking thing is that such a number of kids in the US are being subject to child protection system. 1 in every 3 American child before they turn 18 is investigated. 1 in 3. Now, if no one in this room has been investigated, it tells you we have communities out there where everyone is investigated. 1 in 2 African American kids before they turn 18 are investigated. This is not just called in. This is someone knocked on their door, talked to mom, talked to the children, maybe even talked to the teacher about, is there a case of child abuse and neglect? When we developed the child protection system, we never thought it was going to go drift netting kids at such a rate. And why does it happen? It happens because every time there's a tragedy in the front page, when the opioid crisis hit, we open the front gates of our child protection system, and the calls come in and they flood in. And so one of the ideas behind the Allegheny Family Screening Tool is there's 2 challenges that we're trying to deal with. One is when calls for child abuse and neglect happen, we know that sometimes we're not paying attention to kids we should have paid attention to. How do we know that? Because constantly we're getting children in hospitals, in ICUs with broken bones, and when you look at the history, you saw that people were calling about those kids, and we were what's called screening them out. That is not doing anything about it. But there's also another problem we have. We have a problem that we have a whole bunch of kids coming into child protection, and we're going out investigating, sometimes even opening cases for kids that really we should never have gone out on. The challenge for us is which of these kids are which. And because the floodgates of child protection are so wide open, it's very hard for our frontline workers to be able to separate signal from noise. So the Allegheny Family Screening Tool is the use of algorithms exactly like Thea and Gian have been doing, is looking to see whether we can use the data we already have about the children whose calls are coming in to see if we can start stratifying or identifying children who are at extreme risk and children who are not at risk. Now, that sounds simple. It has been incredibly the most controversial project I have ever worked on. I will show you the scars, but I don't want to put you off. But it was very controversial because people were concerned that this was going to exacerbate bias, that we were taking data from biased systems and we were going to exacerbate it. And we were totally open and honest about everything, all the challenges, but we were also totally open and honest, as the agency was, about the huge problem that we in Allegheny had in front of us, and we as a country had, and frankly, some of the research I've done internationally, we in the developed high-income countries have with how we're opening our floodgates. So the Allegheny Family Screening Tool is a simple tool. When the call comes in, the call screening staff, they're the people who are required to decide whether to screen the child in, that is go investigate, or screen the child out, that is not to do anything. Overall, in the US, around 50% of calls are screened out. Now with the screening tool, they get a screenshot, which is basically this, which tells you what the predictive risk model says is the risk that this child will be removed from home in the next 2 years. For people who are really interested, there was a very nice New York Times piece on this project. It's quite an in-depth article, asks lots of different voices, and I'd really encourage you to read that as a good insight into what the tool does. So in Allegheny, over a year, we have about 14,000 referrals to child welfare. So those are calls that come into counties from parents, from doctors, from mandated reporters, saying we think there might be a case of abuse or neglect here. The county screens out half, screens in half. The way the Allegheny Family Screening Tool works is that when the call comes in, we have an unusual data system in Allegheny, which is we have integrated data. That is that the system harvests data from a whole bunch of different systems. The child welfare system is only one of them. It can go find out whether mom was on TANF, whether dad had any jail stay, jail history, and a whole bunch of other fields. There was homelessness history. It can harvest all those things and bring it to bear to create the risk score. The risk score is then predicting the probability that if you screen this child in, they will have an out-of-home placement in 2 years. The reason we chose out-of-home placement is because we wanted an outcome that was as secure to out-of-system problem. That is, a judge had to decide that this child was at such risk of abuse or if they remained at home, that the judge saw it fit to say the child should be removed. So when we calibrated this data with what's called a holdout set, this is kind of what you see. On the horizontal axis is the scores that were given to the calls. On the vertical axis is the rate of placement, of removal of the children. As you can see, a child who receives a score of 1, only 2.4% of those kids ended up being removed. But over 30% of those kids had been screened in historically. 30% of kids were screened in when there was very little evidence that they were going to end up having egregious outcomes. That's not to say that the screening in wasn't the thing that was solving this problem, but it was pretty clear. And similarly, with children who scored a 20 on our tool, half of them ended up being removed. And I should say we've also calibrated this against our children's hospital data. A child who scores a 20 is 24 times more likely to be hospitalized for maltreatment, injury, than children who score in the bottom from 10 and below. 24 times more likely. They are more likely when they become older to be hospitalized for suicide and self-harm, about 17 times more likely. So we are, even when we go to out-of-system data, finding that these are the children we should be and ought to be most concerned about. So we've had a lot of interesting press and review of our tool. And this is sort of the kind of balance. The ones on the left around the side are ones that have been very positive about the fact that we've had independent ethical review. We've been incredibly transparent. We work very closely with the community. Virginia Eubanks in Automating Inequality was a bit more negative, but she was negative about the use of any of these types of data use in child welfare. So in general, we've had lots of props for our approach. But it's only last month, really, that the evaluation came out. The evaluation was conducted independently of our research team. Our research team is very committed to independent evaluation. I just don't believe that we ought to be evaluating our own interventions. So county managed the intervention. It was funded by a foundation. They put out a call for proposals. Dr. Goldhaber-Fiebert, who's an associate professor at Stanford and in decision science, won the grant. And the first finding, it's an 18-month follow-up. The first finding is there was no unintended adverse consequences. So there was no harm as a result of this tool. There wasn't an increase in screening rates. The second finding is that there was, in his words, a moderate increase in the accuracy of those who were screened in. So more children were not screened in, but the children who were screened in were in higher need. And it reduced the racial disparities of case openings. So the implementation of the tool actually did the reverse to what a lot of the critics were concerned about. Why did it do that? It did it by reducing the screening, slight reduction in the screening rates for Black African American children, and it increased the identification of white children who were at risk. So it did two things, and this is, as a researcher, exactly what I expect. I think these sorts of tools are helpful if they're deployed correctly in reversing unconscious bias. Because think of the world that the score screeners were living in before the tool. They were seeing the race of the child, right? And now what they're seeing is the race of the child, but they're seeing a 50% of Black and African American kids who with a low score. And they're seeing white kids with a high score. So previously, when they might have been using race to imply risk, the score is able to offset some of those unconscious biases. So the next question we're going to ask is whether this type of work is scalable.
Perfect. So as this Allegheny County work was rolling out, any number of other counties and jurisdictions in the U.S. were watching very closely, thinking about whether predictive analytics, predictive risk modeling could also be deployed at the front end of their system. And one of those states was California. So what I'm going to talk about is some work that we've done with the state and the counties of California over the last 2 years to really explore that question as to whether the model that was developed in Allegheny is kind of scalable and generalizable, and most importantly, whether or not these models can be deployed with any degree of accuracy if one does not have the beautiful integrated data warehouse that defines Allegheny County. So Allegheny County is truly unique in having made investments going back 10 plus years to integrate data holdings across the county, from behavioral health to child protection to 911 calls. And so all of that information was already available to frontline staff as they screened calls that came into the hotline, and therefore was also available for mining purposes when developing this algorithm. In California, where we have 58 counties, there is any amount of data that's shared locally at the county level, but what the state wanted to do was first have an open and transparent examination as to whether using just the one data source that is available to every single worker in the state could be used to improve the accuracy of front-end decisions. And that one single data source is the historical child protection data that we have from our state SACWIS system or from our large-scale administrative data system. So what we sought to do in California was very similar to Allegheny. We had some different outcomes we could look at. So we explored predicting everything from a future report of abuse and neglect, 3+ referrals, kind of a chronic measure, foster care placement, and we were predicting that long arc risk. So one of the things that certainly surfaced in Allegheny was not only the sense that perhaps they were screening in and out perhaps the wrong children, but also the recognition that where workers are probably best able to assess immediate safety and risk concerns are those where there is a call that comes in that surfaces a very acute need, but where we're far less good at developing a kind of a profile of what services would be needed is when we're trying to look over that long arc. And this is an algorithm where we were able to harvest 300+ predictors from the administrative child protection data, everything from information about the focal victim child who was the subject of the call, things around their history of child protection involvement, the nature of this allegation, as well as information about other individuals who were on that call, everyone from siblings to parents to perpetrators. What I'm going to talk about are actually the findings that emerged from our attempt to predict foster care placement. As Rima mentioned, that does feel like a good outcome to predict because you have a little bit of that third-party influence in that children are not removed and placed in foster care without the action of the courts. But one of the things I do want to point out is that you'll notice here that we're defining these as system outcomes. I want to fully acknowledge that we have not built a model in any of these jurisdictions that predicts true abuse and neglect. What we are able to do is observe which children are the most likely to either have chronic or future system involvement, because if we know that today and we have the ability to deploy our preventive interventions differently, then hopefully we can reduce the likelihood of that future system involvement. And in the case of foster care placement, hopefully that's something that we can provide services now that would stabilize the family, protect the child, and would reduce the need for an eventual removal. So developing this model, we take the underlying probability, and largely for illustrative purposes, what we've done in California is we've simply used that risk score that's generated and distributed children and referrals into risk deciles. Very simply, everyone gets a score from 1 to 10. The children who have a score of 10, it means that the model believes that they are in the top 10% in terms of the likelihood of foster care placement. A child with a score of 1, that's a child with the lowest risk, it's about 10%. We also liked the decile approach because from a workload standpoint, we know our child protection agencies and frontline workers are strapped, right? And so we're trying to also think about how we can direct their attention effectively with tools such as this. So what do we see when we look at the differentiation that these risk deciles provide when it comes to future risk? We see that when we run the model, and this, by the way, was built on around 3 million observations that we had for the state of California using some historic data. These numbers that I'm presenting here are based on a holdout set of records where we were looking to test the classification accuracy of the algorithm that had been developed. And so what we see is when we look at the 10% of children where the model, on the day the call came in, flagged them as being at highest risk of kind of this deep end system penetration, we do see that 60% of those children ended up placed in foster care. And I also want to really call your attention to the low end of the risk distribution, because one of the things to note is not just that fewer than 1 in 100 children with a score of 1 ended up placed in foster care, but if we look at the bottom 50%, we're seeing a rate of foster care placement that is less than 1 in 100. So mirroring very much the data and the findings that we saw in Allegheny. So then the question is, what is the business use case for this, and how would this actually improve frontline practice above and beyond tools and what we have today? Because maybe what I'm showing you here is exactly what every single worker already knows. Maybe they're already able to figure out who those 10s are and who those 1s are. And so to examine that, what we did is we looked at the highest risk children, according to the model, and we explored how many of those children were screened out without an investigation. And the number's not huge, but we see that about 1 in 5 of those children was just screened out without any kind of in-person assessment by a social worker or caseworker. At the other end of the risk distribution, what we see is even though these were children the model said were quite low risk, we were screening in 63% of those children and families for investigation. So then we said, well, maybe those were good calls, right? Maybe there was something that the model didn't see that was communicated to the caseworker and they knew, and those were good calls. And so what we did is we actually looked at the high-risk children who were screened out to see what happened to them. And what we found is that 1 in 2 still ended up getting re-reported and placed in foster care, okay? So definitely a very, very high number. Hard to argue that there was not a missed opportunity to do something. At the low end, we found that even though we screened in 63% of these children for investigation, which to Rima's point is not without a real burden, not only on the agency in terms of resources, but also the family, we found that fewer than 1 in 100 ever ended up placed in foster care. Now, the low end of the risk distribution is a little tricky. It could be that the mere fact that a caseworker went out did something to remove the risk, but the literature would suggest that that is very unlikely the case. The other thing that we wanted to do is, I mentioned at the outset that we are predicting future system involvement. and that we believe that foster care placement is an important proxy for child safety and harm. But if it's not, then what we are potentially doing is kind of orienting the system to identify children who are not at greatest risk, and we are missing the kids who in fact are. So one of the things that we did is we tried to, just as with Allegheny County, validate the sensitivity of the model to picking up children who are at more objective forms of harm. And so what we did is we took all the children who were in our data and we linked them to vital death records and coded whether there was a maltreatment fatality. And we also linked them to near fatality reports that were filed with the state, indicating there was a very serious abuse or neglect injury. Here's what we found. So if you look at the left hand where you see the gray bars, that's just the distribution of children and referrals overall, because remember, we're putting kids in deciles. On the right-hand side of the screen, what you see is the distribution of children who experienced a near fatality or a fatality. So again, we took a few hundred kids who experienced that severe outcome, and we said, what would their risk score have been had we had this tool in place, and what would it have been at the call that came in before the event itself, the near fatality or the fatality? And what we found is that 59% of those children would have been flagged by the model as falling in that top decile of risk. Another 19% would have been flagged as falling in decile 9. So 78% of these cases would have been flagged as falling in the highest 2 risk deciles. Now, to be clear, there are still children who fall in low risk deciles and die, so I think it would be very, very mistaken for us to hold out any of these tools as things that will prevent all child fatalities. But assuming that we have interventions and protocols that are positive and affect the safety of children, we would be reaching those children who have clearly the highest risk. We then did something else. We also decided to look at cancer as a little bit of a counterfactual. So we also took from our data children who died from cancer, and we said, how would they have been scored by this algorithm? And what we see is that we have built an algorithm that appears to have absolutely no relationship to risk of cancer death, as we would expect and hope it would not, versus a model that is very sensitive to maltreatment, near fatalities, and fatalities. So I only have a minute left, so I'm going to tick through this very quickly as my last slide, this is where I get to offer just a few candid reflections on what are some of the challenges to moving the needle. Working on this predictive risk modeling work, Rima described it as some of the hardest work she's ever done, certainly true for me. It feels very uncomfortable to a lot of audiences that we would be able to use data to inform our understanding of people's risk of something that's very uncomfortable for us to talk about, which is abuse and neglect. But that ignores an empirical reality, which is we have the data today to do a much better job figuring out which children are at risk. I've also been surprised by the number of attacks that are coming from any effort to use data to be more targeted and intentional in our approach to delivering services. People believe and want universal services. I get it. It doesn't need to be an either or, but that's often the way the debate is framed. I've also been surprised. We complain about our child protection system all the time. Think about the headlines. And yet any time we try to innovate with data or new tools, we also seem totally against any opportunity for moving the needle through new tools, new approaches. I also want to mention the racial, ethnic inequalities and disparities. It's amazing that there are some positive findings coming out of Allegheny, not because it's surprising, but because it's been so long since we've had anything that would suggest we can actually move that. And when we attack predictive risk modeling as a tool that will reinforce racial bias, we need to acknowledge that we have to be very careful, but we ignore the reality that we have human decision makers with lots of bias as well. And finally, I do believe that we have a problem in the field where we tend to adopt a particular tool, a particular protocol, a particular program, and government has it, and we just stop there, and we use things that are 10, 15, 20 years old. And so whether it's predictive risk modeling or other new interventions that are being deployed, something where I hope that there is more investment in that work. Thank you.
I told you that was going to be fascinating. Well, thank you all. That was really just really interesting work, and it is rare, unfortunately, to see this kind of innovation sometimes in this field, and it's very refreshing to be able to hear from all of you today. So I guess I want to actually start there with this question of what are the barriers to innovation that all of you have faced? We've talked a little bit about kind of the territorial aspect. Different counties have different priorities. Is our decentralized system the biggest problem? Is there anything the federal government can do to sort of help us get over this? So I just, maybe if each of you want to address kind of what you think are the biggest barriers to innovation in this, I'd love to hear from it.
Well, I'm happy to start. I think that there are real challenges when we have existing tools that are threatened by innovations. So I'll be clear, there are risk assessment tools that are used in child protection. They were developed 15, 20 years ago. And anything that is new and is being rolled out is a threat to basically the monopoly that those vendors have when it comes to those tools. So that's been kind of one reality. I think the other reality is that our child protection agencies and our government agencies are so under a magnifying glass that there is a real fear of trying new things, because if it fails, it may be a very high-profile failure, and there is a long history of heads rolling anytime there is a mistake made. And so there's just not much room for any missteps, and yet we continue to have many of the same missteps because we're not willing or able to give them the room to try new things.
For me, just to echo what Emily has said, definitely a barrier would be a resistance to change. That we are literally taking our technology and our ideas, but oftentimes, even when you get the buy-in from the leadership, you have to sort of enlist this full support and participation of the person whose job it is to do that, to make that placement decision. And oftentimes what you're running up against is, as Emily said, decades of other types of practice, of other types of ways of solving the problem. And so a lot of time and energy has to be kind of coupled with the ability to get in the trenches with them. It can't just be something that you sort of set on the table and walk away from and check in after, a couple of years from then. You have to build the relationships. You have to know the people and invest in those local communities. And that takes funding, which I think is the second biggest barrier to getting these sorts of ideas and innovations out there, is that to not just provide the technology, the resource, but then to actually have the programmatic arm that's really helping root it into the community that you're trying to serve.
So my takeaways, I think we have a very high turnover of leadership in child welfare because we have a very immature attitude to how to assess their performance. And that is really stifling innovation because they can't get warm in their seat. They can't build good community trust because and the lack of community trust. You need social license to innovate. You get social license by showing and partnering with communities for the long haul. Very hard for our child welfare directors to get social license to innovate because they're not there long enough.
I think there are really two things. One is, as I think has been a compelling picture here, you can resolve a lot of problems when you have the right data and the right systems in place to be able to build the algorithms. But the systems themselves were built in a world that was not interoperable with each other. So you see a lot of divided counties and agencies and states that have different systems that don't talk to each other. And I think one of the great things Emily has done is be able to bring divergent systems in California together into one place to be able to leverage, hey, there is data on whether or not kids face adverse outcomes that we can bring in, but those systems didn't talk to each other until someone actually made the effort to do that. That limitation on the data means that you can't let the algorithm do all of the things that are out there. I think the second thing actually lies a little bit on us, which is like we think of algorithmic solutions, but we don't necessarily think about giving value back to the caseworkers themselves. Like, how is it that this makes your job and your life easier? And one of the things that I've discovered in other places, as soon as you say, here's an algorithm, and guess what? It lets you do your job better, and you can focus things on what you need to do, and you don't have to go home every night feeling emotionally overtaxed because you couldn't get to everything. There's much more buy-in to be there. So I think this, like as we said, this is not a silver bullet. Like, you actually need to get buy-in, and you actually need to give value back to the people who are going to be using this.
Yeah, I was actually, I don't know if you mentioned it, Thea, but I think something that maybe people who are not in this world don't understand is that a lot of the caseworkers actually, in the short term, they like this sort of territorial kind of position they take because it's their job to find a bed for this child tonight. And if they give up those homes to this greater pool, they're worried that when it comes time to find a bed for the child tonight, that the family that they always turn to in this case is not going to be there.
That's
and
right.
so getting them to see these long-term outcomes is a harder sell.
Right. What was interesting to us when we were rolling out in Florida, our hypothesis was that we would have the most amount of matches from outside the location of where the child was situated or located. And what we found was that 45% of our matches, actually, I don't know if I mentioned that in the talk, were actually from out of county. So the majority of the matches were actually still happening where the child and family both had shared residency. That was really compelling and also sort of alleviated some of those fears from workers that just thought it was a transactional system in which we're going to like give you all of our families when they're already so scared of losing people, but then also to see that it could be a bidirectional focus and approach.
And you understand where the caseworkers are coming from because this is the system that they have been dealing with for the entire duration of their careers. And it's very counterintuitive to think like, oh, actually, if I put into this whole system, I have more options to be able to place my children, not less options to be able to place my system. It's just not the way that they have been trained to think for the longest time.
Right. All of you mentioned, Emily and Rima, you touched on a little more the race question. How much of the kind of skepticism about innovation or the concern about too much innovation has to do with not wanting to go anywhere near the race issues in this country right now and sort of just tiptoeing past them and making sure that you as a government official or you as an agency just are not getting criticized for taking the wrong tack there?
So I guess I can speak because I'm sort of an outsider, and we actually did a very interesting research project where me and a couple of design colleagues went into US and New Zealand context of families whose children have been removed and families of color to understand why and how they felt uncomfortable about algorithms, and one in child welfare. And we found that what was happening is that they had so little trust of the system that any innovation that the system was producing was endowed with the same level of distrust. So it could be an innovation that we thought was actually going to improve things or an innovation that was going to worsen things. But because the system already was so distrusted, that innovation that happened out of that system was incredibly distrusted. So that's a really interesting finding for us because you realize that there is a sort of a foundational issues that we have to work with the trust of the system in order to get that social license.
Listen, I think that race is a really tricky topic, and I think it's terrifying for government officials to potentially push out or suggest a tool where we don't quite know what it will yield, and where we need to fully acknowledge that if we think that our past practice was biased and did lead to the over-surveillance and over-intervention of services with low-income and minority children and families, then yes, that is going to be baked into some effect within the data. So I think the most important thing is that we just talk about it and be open about it. But what I will say, and these are some findings I didn't talk about, when we look at the data in California, the algorithms can help surface where those
kind of disparities or that unwarranted variation is emerging in today's practice. So when we look at those very low-risk families and we look at low-risk Latino, African American, and white children, what we see is current practice is leading to systematically higher rates of screening in for our low-risk children who are Latino and African American. And at the other end, we're seeing that we are systematically screening out more of our high-risk white children. So exactly what we see in Allegheny. And so the conversation needs to be not is there bias in the data, there is, not is this going to solve everything, it won't, but how do we on the margin start to use tools like this so we can be more intentional in addressing some of the historic biases.
And I think when the systems are designed well and accountable to themselves for their outcomes, you can actually make changes to be able to address those issues. What I think happens a lot of times in the current systems is you have a system, those problems are there, but because you are not looking at the long-term outcomes and connecting those dots, you actually never see that this thing is biased out there. Because the systems that we're building are actually being held accountable, you can shine light and then make corrections. And yes, there are definitely systems out there that bake in bias, but if you have a human-in-the-loop system that's being very cautious about how it's being interpreted and being applied, you can address that problem as it arises.
John, I wanted to ask you about the algorithm itself that you're using. I know you mentioned, Thea, that I think you said 59% of the families that you surveyed said they were open to adopting across racial lines. Is that one of the questions that you're asking in terms of a match? And do you think that the fact that families can say that, in their survey makes them more open about what they are and aren't willing to accept?
So I'll take the first part of that question, and then John, if you want to talk about the other algorithm part. But we actually, the questions around those deal breakers, is kind of our code name, which we're changing to conversation starters, because what we're finding is actually what families say, I want to adopt, their first day in a class, they're being presented with a checklist. Tell us everything you want in a child, and they don't realize that at that moment in time, they're being cemented to all of those things that they've said. And so on our end, we ask for what was your home study actually licensed you to provide services for. And there are home studies that will inform that the family can take a certain number of kids, a certain number of like a gender, like if there's a gender preference, it'll bake in and say that this family has been approved for all genders or just a type of that. And so what we do on our end is just validate with that extra information to make sure that the families in our matching pool are not only approved and eligible, but actually what they've said their preferences are, in fact, match what they've been approved and legally have been found to be able to support as far as a child. I don't know if you want to take the...
And then in terms of preferences themselves, in multiple different contexts, you find that preferences are very soft. So people in dating relationships will say, I don't ever want somebody who smokes. You say, well, would you take this person who fits all of your other criteria, but they smoke twice a year? And people go, oh, of course I'd take someone who smokes twice a year. So when you press people on that, you generally find that their range of options is wider than they might give preference to. And linking those into the system allows you to make those expansions.
Which, if I could just say too, Naomi, the benefit of a lot of times when we talk about matching systems in foster care or adoption, what is really being said is it's a series of filtered searches. And depending upon how the system has been wired on the back end, your age preference could be cutting you off at a day or 2 days after the date of birth of the child and the age range of the family that wants to adopt them. So, but it was interesting, we did a couple of more questions and queries on just our total family pool and asked them, for gender specifically, because that seemed to be a big one, 64% are open to either male or female. We asked, if given information on another child that was the opposite gender, would you be willing to accept placement? And 90% of our families said, oh, absolutely, we would strongly consider that. So these artificial parameters that we're sort of self-imposing on families, I think, has done a mass injustice and has eliminated swaths of families that otherwise could have been great candidates for our kids.
All right, well, I think we're going to open it up for questions now. We have a microphone, so if you'll wait until the microphone comes and just tell us your name, and please be sure to ask a question, not just make a statement. So, any questions? Back there.
Hi. I'm from Mississippi, and what happens with the risk model when the state is corrupt and it's not necessarily the family? because I have a feeling that's probably not built into your model. And there's a case in Mississippi where the house was actually recorded and the child was tracked long-term through their employment as an adult without it ever being disclosed. It's been reported to the police and it still has not been cleaned up or been taken care of. And I guarantee you that's not in your risk model. So your model is only as good as reality. And so, I mean, you can build the risk model and defend the risk model, but the problem is if the state is corrupt, that is also an issue.
So I wouldn't disagree. The models that have been deployed in Allegheny and Colorado and the proof of concept research that we were doing in California was really focused on that very upstream triaging decision where we've got partial information that's often communicated about a child's safety from the caller, and the hotline screener is being charged with making a very important decision. Are we screening this in for additional kind of at least eyes or not? So in that sense, the risk tool wouldn't touch anything at the very back end at this point, but I hear you.
And can I just say, we train, so one of the important things is to train staff on how they use the algorithm. And one of the ways we train staff is by showing them things that the algorithm got wrong. Because it's really important to keep them hyper vigilant to exactly that there is context in the data and there's actually sometimes data that's wrong. Yeah.
Can you give me an example of what you would say about what the algorithm got wrong? What you would say to someone about that? Like an example.
So when we did simulations for our frontline workers in Colorado, and we stratified the cases based on whether. So there are true positives and false positives, and true negatives and false negatives, and we stratified enough of the false. And then they started to see that they had screened them in, and the algorithm had told them not to, and then they followed it, and they were right, and the algorithm was wrong, and they reflected about maybe they were seeing things in that day's allegations that they had been vigilant to, that the algorithm had not. And it's really important when you train to make sure that they see enough of those so they're reflective in their practice and they understand.
And I think there's really two very critical pieces that come out of your point and your question. One is the models are only as good as the data that is there. So you have to be very cautious about what data sources you're linking into. And if those data sources are not quality, then the model itself is not going to. You can't produce something on data that's poor. The second thing is to never take away the efficacy of the caseworkers or those who are on the front lines. They are the ones that are ultimately accountable for the decision. So these are tools for them to try to make better decisions and focus their attention. But if they sense that something is wrong, you need to empower them to be able to make that call at that point.
Go ahead.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. Chris Kingsley at the Casey Foundation. You've been at some pains to talk about, and this is really a question for Emily and Rima, the application of your tool at the front end of the child welfare system. And you also mentioned that one of the things that makes innovation in that system is difficult is because agencies are under such pressure, right, to ensure that no child is seriously harmed or dies in their care. So there must be huge incentives for agencies to want to apply these tools deeper into the system to kids who are already known to child welfare. Can you talk a little bit about the potential application of these tools there, what's already being done in that space, and what limits you would place on sort of what the data science supports and does not?
Sure. So I know that there are jurisdictions that are exploring applications further into the system, including when we reunify families, can we identify those where there may be greater evidence of need for, say, wraparound services or continued supports after reunification to prevent reentry. There are also use cases around ongoing quality assurance and supervision for open cases that may be more complex, where knowing that there's a greater risk and more complexity, you would just want to devote some additional resources and attention. I also think that it's very interesting with the new Family First legislation, which for those of you who are not steeped in child welfare is important federal legislation. I know it was a topic of the panel a few weeks ago. One of the things that will come up is there will be new prevention dollars flowing from the feds down to the states, and the states are going to need to figure out how they are defining candidacy for those prevention services. And the definition is that these need to be individuals who are at imminent risk of foster care placement. So one of the other conversations we've heard with a number of jurisdictions is maybe tools like this can help us to define candidacy so that we can draw down additional prevention dollars and supports for families where now we have an empirical basis for saying that this child is actually at risk of foster care placement versus just trying to come up with our own definition.
Can I just also jump in there, because I'm a bit worried about sort of wholesale prediction of foster placement, because there are good and bad. So we've just been doing some work linking in New Zealand just to try to get a handle on what features of foster care placement we would all agree was a bad one, because turnover is that we've linked it to suicide and self-harm, to criminal justice involvement, to school dropout, to truancy, real objective stuff, and trying to understand and unpack what things we really think are bad in foster care. Because at the moment, it just feels like everyone's saying foster care is bad, so we should just predict foster care, and if you're at risk of, and reunification is good, and if you predict reunification, and our simple predictive, simple odds ratios, so that reunification is sometimes harmful for children. So I think, we first need to know what is a bad thing before we know to avoid it.
Questions? I wanted to follow up just quickly with you, Thea and John. One of the things that I know you're trying to avoid with the program is the adoption disruption. And I wonder if you can just sort of try to quantify that. I think a lot of people are kind of unaware of how many of these attempted adoptions don't work out, and why that is.
Sure. So what we've had access to is just an understanding that about 2/3 of children in foster care, so of all of the 443,000 kids, 2/3 of them will likely experience a minimum of 3 placement moves by their 13th month in care. And so this is, if you can imagine just sort of the trauma that actually inflicts on the neurobiological development of a child. We now know the research is there to support how areas of the brain that are most impacted whenever a child and family are separated for whatever reason, it actually impacts the area of the brain that controls emotional regulation and self-control. So the behavioral issues that start to pop up, literally we're kind of eradicating a child's ability in care to form long-lasting attachment. So it's a huge issue, and certainly it impacts both on an adoption placement side, but also just the front of the spear when a child actually has to come into foster care. Our mission, our focus is really how can we use this data to best inform that first placement so that it's the only placement until the child needs to either be reunified or some other case plan is created for that child. I don't know if you,
And just one last question, unless there are any others. I wanted to just ask about, we talked a little bit about how there's not a lot of funding for the programs like this. What are you seeing from foundations in terms of their interest in supporting this work, and who would you like to see supporting this work going forward?
Well,
there's your wish list. Yes.
Your wish list.
Yes. Funding is absolutely huge. I think one of the barriers we've had, we've had a lot of interest from actually just private individuals. One in particular that has really lighted the way for us down in Florida is actually by 2 philanthropists, Ed and Ashley Brown, that created the Selfless Love Foundation. But they're a brand new foundation. We get a lot of excitement from new foundations and philanthropic people. Where we start to hit the kind of the friction is with really big, long, historically old foundations that typically require, a 1 to 2 year relationship buildup before, you're even invited to apply for a grant. And simply when you're trying to kind of bring something like Family Match to scale, it's not that we don't want to get to know you, it's just that we don't have time to kind of jumping through those hoops just for the opportunity to apply. Certainly, we have our eyes on a number of organizations. I think hopefully one day, maybe even the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative would love to step up.
You have it in there.
Yeah, I do. I have it in there. The Balmer Foundation, Certainly the people behind AEI, I know there's incredible resources and funding out there, but the problem is the ability to access and actually scale this so that we can do that in a more simplified way.
And from a broader perspective, the funding is very complex because the technological solutions need multiple different ways. It's not just about building the relationships or building a tool. There's compelling examples of how you need policy work that's to be done. You need technology work that needs to be done. You need on the ground program work that needs to be done. And a lot of the structures in place don't consider all of those different aspects.
And the only thing I will say on the funding front is you guys have a beautiful use case. It makes people feel good. The work that Rima and I are doing, I think, is critical. But we have talked to so many foundations that are really interested in having those first conversations, but I think are still a little bit hesitant. They're nervous to kind of dive into predictive risk modeling because it's a little bit controversial, and they're not quite sure what that will imply. But I agree that it's complex in terms of the technology and the development, but in the whole big scheme of things, it's actually a relatively small investment to help a jurisdiction get from the R&D side, which is the necessary model development, to the implementation. So we're not talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to design complex interoperable systems. We've shown that actually you can do this work and add value to current practice with just existing data without even all of those cross-system builds. So that would be my take.
And I do feel like the foundations don't understand child welfare as well as they do some other fields. So I think there's a really crucial, important role in educating them, just about the 1 in 3 number, just about how the system works. I would really welcome any opportunity to just get foundations sort of at ground zero with child welfare.
Well, hopefully this is one of them. Please join me in thanking our panel today.